Hello everyone and welcome back to your worst nightmare YouTube channel. To help us feel even more connected as a community, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are watching from. If you would like to share some of your horror encounter, do well to email us through the description of this video. Don't forget to smash the like and subscribe button. Thanks. Now, back to today's episode. I will never forget the night that my life was saved by a drink that nearly cost me everything. That's how it all began. I'm Kyle, an EMT working the night shift. It was supposed to be a routine shift, but it turned into something I'd never imagined. The night had started normally. Calls came in and out, the usual mix of accidents and medical emergencies. Around 2 a.m., my partner and I were on our way to a call about a car crash on the freeway. I was tired, nothing unusual for a night shift, but I was managing. I reached for my Red Bull to keep me going, a habit I'd picked up to stave off exhaustion. I twisted open the can and took a long sip. When we arrived at the scene, the chaos was more than expected. The wreck was severe, a head-on collision with multiple casualties. We immediately went to work. I was focused on a young woman, barely conscious, when my radio crackled to life. Dispatch to all units, we have a 10 to 72 possible heart attack at the corner of 5th and Elm. Immediate response required. My stomach sank. Heart attacks in young people were rare, and they often meant something serious. We finished up at the crash site as quickly as possible and headed to the new call. On the way, I noticed something odd. My vision blurred briefly, like I just blinked and the world had shifted slightly. I shook it off, blaming the fatigue. When we arrived at the address, the house was dark and quiet. We knocked, and a middle-aged man answered, looking pale and shaky. His wife, he explained, had collapsed upstairs. I grabbed my gear and rushed up, but the sight that met me at the top of the stairs froze me in place. The woman was lying on the bed, breathing heavily, but it was her appearance that made my heart race. Her skin was an unnatural, ashen color, and her eyes were wide open, glassy and unseeing. I quickly moved to check her pulse. It was weak and erratic. I started administering CPR and calling for advanced support. My hands felt shaky and cold, and I started to sweat. In a panic, I took another sip of my Red Bull, hoping it would help me focus. But as the liquid hit my stomach, a horrifying realization hit me. The woman's pulse was syncing with the beat of my own heart. My pulse raced, and it felt like there was something wrong, something beyond medical explanation. The woman's breathing became slower, and I heard her mutter something. I leaned in to listen. "Help me." The words were barely audible, but they seemed to come from deep within her. I could see the pain and desperation in her eyes. I checked my watch. Paramedics were minutes away, but every second felt like an eternity. I kept working on her, feeling increasingly disoriented. My vision swam, and it felt like the room was spinning. The Red Bull seemed to be amplifying everything, my anxiety, the woman's distress. I took another sip, and suddenly everything became clear. My vision sharpened, and I saw the woman's face morph in a grotesque way, her eyes now focused intently on me with an unnatural intensity. It felt like the energy drink was somehow connecting us in a way I couldn't understand. Her breathing matched the rhythm of my own, and I could feel the strain of her life slipping away in sync with my heartbeat. When the paramedics arrived, they took over immediately. I stepped back, feeling utterly exhausted and confused. The woman was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. She was declared dead on arrival. Later, I learned from the dispatch records that there was a mix-up with the addresses. The call I had responded to was not supposed to be for this woman. It was a case of mistaken identity. The real call was for someone else, someone whose life might have been saved if I had gone to the right address. The most unsettling part, The Red Bull I had been drinking had a strange aftertaste, a chemical tang I couldn't quite place. I went back to the convenience store where I bought it, but they had no record of the batch or any unusual complaints. I don't know what happened that night. Was it just my exhaustion, or was there something more sinister at play? All I know is that every time I think of that Red Bull, I shudder. I can't help but wonder if it was more than just a drink, and if it somehow played a part in that horrifying night. I still work as an EMT, but I've stopped drinking energy drinks altogether. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see the woman's eyes staring back at me, and I can't shake the feeling that I've seen something truly terrifying, something that defies all logic and reason. My name is Sarah Jenkins, and I'm an EMT. For years, I've seen things that would haunt most people for a lifetime, but nothing prepared me for that night, a night that shook me to my core and left me questioning my own sanity. It was a cold October evening when I got a strange call. My dispatcher, Dave, sounded unusually alarmed, which was strange because he was usually calm and collected. "Sarah, we've got a situation at the Hanley residence. It's bad. There's no other way to say it. Just get there as fast as you can." He didn't need to say more. I could hear the urgency in his voice. I gathered my team and we rushed to the address, hoping for the best but preparing for the worst. When we arrived, the Hanley house looked strangely normal, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me something was very wrong. The front door was ajar, and a thin trail of blood led into the house. I pushed the door open and called out, "EMT. Is anyone here?" No response. We carefully made our way through the living room, which was unusually neat despite the blood trail. As we moved deeper into the house, I noticed something strange. The house was filled with an overwhelming silence. No crying children, no anxious parents, just a suffocating quiet atmosphere. We reached the kitchen, where we found Mr. and Mrs. Hanley. They were sitting at the table, their expressions blank. It was as if they were in a trance. Their eyes were glazed over, and they barely acknowledged our presence. A pair of blood-stained scissors lay beside them, but they seemed unfazed by the sight. "Are you okay?" I asked, kneeling in front of them, but they didn't respond. Their eyes remained fixed on something unseen. Suddenly, I heard a soft, muffled cry coming from upstairs. "We need to check upstairs," I instructed my team. As we ascended the stairs, the cries grew louder, desperate, almost pleading. At the top of the stairs, we found the source, two young children, Emily and Ben. They were huddled together in a corner of their room, their faces filled with tears. But what made my heart stop was the sight of their father, Mr. Hanley, standing in the doorway behind them. He was holding a knife, his eyes wide and vacant. I stepped forward, trying to calm him down. "Mr. Hanley, put the knife down. We're here to help." Instead of responding, he stared at me as if he didn't recognize me. His gaze was unsettling, almost as if he was looking through me rather than at me. I took a step closer, but he suddenly lunged towards me, forcing me to back away. In that moment, I felt a surge of fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. We had to restrain him, but it took all of our strength. As we struggled, Mrs. Hanley appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes now wide with panic. She frantically shouted something about needing to protect the children, but her words were incoherent. Once we managed to restrain Mr. Hanley and get him downstairs, the situation only got more bizarre. The children were safely in our care, but the entire scene felt surreal. Mrs. Hanley continued to cry uncontrollably, and Mr. Hanley's behavior was erratic. He would shift from calm to aggressive in a matter of seconds. As we transported them to the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The house was clean, but there was an undercurrent of dread that I couldn't explain. The bloodstain seemed to tell a story that wasn't adding up. Back at the station, I tried to piece together what had happened. I checked the dispatch logs and found that Dave's urgency wasn't just for dramatic effect. He was genuinely scared. I spoke with him, and he revealed something chilling. He had received multiple calls from Mrs. Hanley that evening, each one more frantic than the last. But the last call had been different. It was a recording of someone crying, accompanied by the sound of heavy breathing and strange murmurs. Dave couldn't make sense of it, but he knew it wasn't right. The following day, I received a call from a colleague who had been at the hospital with the Hamleys. Apparently, the family had been examined, but there were no clear explanations for their behavior. The children were traumatized, but physically unharmed. Mr. and Mrs. Hanley were placed under psychiatric observation, and their behavior was deemed to be a result of severe psychological stress, though no one could determine the exact cause. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something crucial. I went back to the house to investigate further, hoping to find answers. The house was now empty and quiet, and everything was in place as it had been before. However, when I examined the room where the children had been hiding, I found a hidden compartment behind the closet. Inside was a stack of old family photos and a diary belonging to Mrs. Hanley. The diary entries were disturbing. They spoke of a growing sense of paranoia and fear that Mrs. Hanley had been experiencing. The final entry described her belief that someone, or something, was trying to infiltrate their home, driving them to the edge of insanity. The entries were dated around the time when their behavior had started to change drastically. I never found concrete evidence to explain what happened that night, but the experience left a deep impression on me. The Hanleys were eventually discharged from the hospital and sent to a specialist for further treatment, but the memory of that night haunted me. The terror in their eyes, the inexplicable violence, and the eerie silence of their home created a chilling mystery that has never been fully solved. I'll never forget the night I was called to that house. As an EMT, I've seen my share of horrifying scenes, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that evening. It was one of those nights when everything seemed normal, only to turn into a nightmare. It was a brisk autumn evening when the call came in. The dispatcher's voice was calm but strained, relaying a report of a domestic disturbance that had escalated into a medical emergency. The address was in a quiet suburb, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. I thought it would be a simple, if unfortunate, case of someone having a bad night. When my partner, Dave, and I arrived, we were greeted by the sight of a modest two-story house. The front yard was well kept, with neatly trimmed bushes and a swing set in the corner. It looked like the perfect place for a family to settle down. But as we walked up the driveway, the atmosphere felt off. There was an uneasy stillness, as if the house was holding its breath. We knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it creaked open. A woman in her mid-40s stood there. Her face looked pale. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she looked like she had been crying. She introduced herself as Marie and quickly ushered us inside. The house was strangely quiet. We followed Marie through the hallway and into the living room, where the scene that unfolded before us was both shocking and perplexing. A man in his 50s was lying on the floor, his face twisted in pain. He was clearly in distress, but the strange part was the absence of any visible injuries. There were no cuts, bruises, or signs of physical trauma. His wife, Marie, was frantically trying to explain what had happened. He just started screaming, Marie said, her voice trembling. And then he fell to the floor. I don't know what's wrong with him. He's been like this for the last hour. As we assessed the man, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. His breathing was shallow, and his pulse was unsteady, but without visible signs of injury or illness, we were at a loss. We decided to administer oxygen and monitor his vital signs while trying to gather more information. Marie's story grew increasingly unsettling as she spoke. She revealed that her husband, Tom, had been acting strangely over the past week. He had been unusually quiet and withdrawn, but she attributed it to stress from work. The day before, he had started talking about seeing things and being watched. Marie thought it was just paranoia until he collapsed on the living room floor. I tried to keep my focus on Tom, but my mind couldn't help but drift to Marie's strange behavior. She seemed too calm, almost detached. I asked her if there was anyone else in the house, and she hesitated before mentioning their teenage son, Jack. She said he was upstairs in his room, but he hadn't come down to see what was happening. I sent Dave to check on Jack while I continued to monitor Tom. It was then that I heard a disturbing sound coming from the upper floor, a muffled thumping noise, like someone trying to get out of a confined space. My heart raced as I realized that the sound was coming from Jack's room. When Dave returned, his face was as pale as Marie's. He told me that Jack wasn't in his room, but the door was locked from the inside, and there was no response when he knocked. I knew we had to act quickly. I kicked the door open, and what we found inside was beyond anything I could have imagined. Jack's room was in disarray, with clothes and books strewn everywhere. But what caught our attention was a large, wooden crate in the corner of the room. The crate was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it had been forgotten. I pried it open, and inside, we found a collection of old photographs and letters, along with a small, ornate box. The box was locked, but it was clear that it had been tampered with. I used a crowbar to force it open, and inside, we discovered a set of disturbing, handwritten notes. The notes detailed a series of events that were both chilling and bewildering. They spoke of a pact made by Tom and Marie many years ago, something involving a sacrifice to ensure their family's success and safety. The notes were filled with incoherent ramblings about the price of protection and the cost of peace. It was then that Marie's demeanor changed. She became frantic, insisting that we needed to leave immediately. She begged us not to read the notes and to get Tom out of the house. Her desperation was palpable, but it was too late. Tom's condition was worsening, and we had no choice but to continue our efforts to stabilize him. As we prepared to transport Tom to the hospital, Marie's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She started shouting and pleading with us to leave her family alone, as if we were intruding on something sacred. Her pleas made no sense, and her irrational behavior only heightened our sense of unease. The drive to the hospital was tense, with Marie sitting in the back of the ambulance, her eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows. Tom's condition deteriorated further, and despite our best efforts, he passed away shortly after we arrived at the hospital. The doctors were baffled by the sudden and unexplained nature of his death, and Marie's erratic behavior only added to the mystery. As for Marie and Jack, they vanished without a trace shortly after Tom's death. Their house was abandoned, and there were no leads on their whereabouts. The crate, the notes, and the box were never found again. The case remains unsolved, and every time I think about that night, I'm haunted by the unanswered questions and the unsettling feeling that something profoundly disturbing had been hidden from us. I've seen a lot in my years as an EMT, but that night still chills me to my core. It was a chilly autumn evening, and the full moon cast a strange glow over the empty streets of our small town. I had just finished my shift as an EMT and was ready to head home when the call came in. It was a routine request, or so I thought, an emergency at a local daycare center. Little did I know that this call would haunt me forever. As I approached the daycare, the first thing that struck me was the silence. It was unsettling, given that it was usually filled with the sounds of children playing. The center's lights flickered intermittently, and I could see that the front door was ajar. My partner, Jake, and I exchanged a worried glance before we made our way inside. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no response. We moved cautiously through the darkened hallway, the creaking floorboards amplifying our every step. The smell of something burning hit my nostrils, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't until we reached the main playroom that I understood. The sight was unlike anything I had ever encountered. The room was a mess, tables overturned, toys scattered everywhere. But it wasn't the mess that was disturbing. It was the children. They were lying motionless on the floor, their eyes wide open and vacant. Their breathing was shallow and unsteady. Panic surged through me. I knelt beside the nearest child, a little girl with golden curls. Her skin was pale, and her lips were pale blue. I began checking her vitals, trying to calm my racing heart. "Jake, we need to get these kids out of here. Call for backup, now." Jake fumbled with his radio, but there was no signal. It was as if the building itself was blocking any attempt to communicate with the outside world. My mind raced as I desperately tried to remember the steps for treating children in such a severe situation. One by one, I checked the kids, but they were all in the same state. Their pulse was faint, their breathing unsteady. I could feel the panic rising in my chest as I realized that time was running out. "Where are the adults?" Jake's voice was tight with stress. He had found a few of the daycare workers unconscious in a back room, but they were breathing shallowly. I looked around, hoping to find some clue to what had happened. It was then that I noticed something strange, an old-looking doll lying in the corner of the room. It was covered in dirt, its eyes cracked and hollow. I picked it up, feeling a strange chill run down my spine. There was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound, almost like a whisper. I turned around, but there was no one there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up immediately. The only movement in the room came from the flashing lights above us, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. Jake and I managed to get the children out of the building, our hands trembling as we loaded them into the ambulance. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight. As we drove to the hospital, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, my eyes searching for anything unusual. The children were still unconscious, their tiny bodies pale and lifeless. I prayed they would wake up soon, that this nightmare would end. The hospital staff took over once we arrived, working feverishly to stabilize the children. It was only then that I learned the true horror of the situation. The daycare had been operating illegally for years, with no one knowing its originality. The owner had been reported missing, and the place had been poorly maintained, with outdated equipment and unsafe conditions. The authorities conducted a thorough investigation, but no conclusive answers were ever found. The children eventually woke up, but they were left with lingering health issues. Some developed severe respiratory problems, while others suffered from psychological trauma. The daycare was shut down, but the damage had already been done. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had missed something crucial. The doll remained a mystery, its origin unknown. I often wondered if it had something to do with what happened that night. It was a constant reminder of the horror we had faced. Months later, I received a letter from one of the families whose child had been affected. It was a thank you note, but it ended with a chilling sentence: "We're just glad our child is safe." We still don't understand why the doll was found in the playroom, but we hope you do. I never found out the truth behind the doll or the full extent of the horrors that occurred in that daycare. But every time I close my eyes, I see those vacant eyes staring back at me, and I wonder if I'll ever escape the nightmare of that night. It was around midnight, and the streets were strangely quiet, except for the occasional hum of distant traffic. I was patrolling a residential area known for its tranquility. The usual calm was shattered when I noticed a sedan with a broken tail light. Nothing seemed unusual at first, just another late-night driver. I initiated a traffic stop, pulling the car over in a dimly lit area, and flipped on my flashlight. As I approached the driver's side window, I could see a figure slumped behind the wheel. The car reeked of old cigarettes and stale coffee. I tapped on the window, and the driver slowly rolled it down, revealing a man in his mid-40s with untidy hair and a hollow gaze. His eyes darted around nervously, avoiding mine. "Good evening, sir. Do you know why I pulled you over?" I asked, trying to maintain a professional tone. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he fumbled with his wallet, almost dropping it as he tried to produce his license and registration. I noticed something odd. The man's hands were trembling, and his voice was shaky when he spoke. "Yes, officer. I'm sorry about the tail light. It's been broken for a while. I haven't had the chance to fix it," he stammered. As I took his documents and walked back to my patrol car, I noticed the interior of the sedan was cluttered with papers and fast food wrappers. The mess was so extreme. I checked the man's information through the system, and everything seemed to check out: no warrants, no outstanding issues. But something didn't sit right with me. There was an unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach, one that I couldn't quite shake. I walked back to the driver's side window and handed the man his documents. "All right, I'm issuing you a warning for the tail light. Get it fixed soon, okay?" I said, trying to offer a reassuring smile. Just as I was about to turn away, the man's voice broke through the night. "Can I ask you something, officer?" I turned back, expecting a routine question. Instead, he leaned closer and whispered, "There's someone else in the car. I think they're planning something bad." The words hung in the air, chilling and cryptic. I glanced at the back seat but saw nothing unusual. "There's no one else in the car, sir." "I checked," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. He shook his head violently, his fear now intense. "No, you don't understand. They're hiding." Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate further. I asked the driver to step out of the car, and he complied, his movements slow and apprehensive. I shone my flashlight into the back seat, but it was empty, just a few more fast food wrappers and a crumpled blanket. That's when I heard it, a faint, muffled noise from the trunk. My heart raced. I'd seen enough to know that this could be something serious. I immediately called for backup and waited in the cold, my breath visible in the frigid air. When my fellow officers arrived, we opened the trunk together. What we found inside was beyond anything I had anticipated. There, bound and gagged, was a young woman, her eyes wide with terror. Her clothes were torn, and she had clearly been restrained for some time. We immediately freed her and called for medical assistance. She was in shock, unable to speak coherently at first, but eventually, she managed to tell us that the driver had abducted her days earlier. The man was arrested on the spot, his face blank and unreadable. During interrogation, he confessed to a series of similar crimes, revealing a disturbing pattern of abduction and torture. It turned out that he had used his broken tail light as a lure to attract unsuspecting victims, believing that they would be more inclined to stop for him. The woman was taken to a safe location, and she eventually recovered from the ordeal, though the trauma would stay with her forever. The case made headlines, and the story of the man's crimes shocked the community. But for me, the most disturbing part was the realization that I had been inches away from encountering something far more sinister. The incident changed how I view my job. I used to think that as long as the paperwork was in order, everything was fine. But now, I understand that there can be more lurking beneath the surface, something dark and terrifying. I still patrol those streets, but every time I pull someone over, I can't shake the fear that I might stumble upon another nightmare. What haunts me the most is the man's warning. Was it an attempt to deceive, or was there something he genuinely feared? The line between truth and deception blurred that night, leaving me with questions I may never answer. As an EMT, I've seen my share of disturbing scenes. Car crashes, overdoses, violent crimes. It's all part of the job. But there's one call that defies logic and keeps me awake at night. It was a call that left me questioning not only my sanity, but the very nature of life and death itself. It was a cold, foggy night in November, and I was on the night shift with my partner, Sarah. We were parked near the edge of town, waiting for the next call. The fog was so thick you could barely see a few feet in front of you. It was the kind of night that made everything seem strange and feel cool, but that was just the job. Or so I thought. The radio crackled to life with a call that seemed, at first, routine. Unit 43, we have a reported cardiac arrest at 1208 Riverside Drive. Respond immediately. Cardiac arrest is never our routine case, but it's something we're trained for. We know the steps. We know what to do. At least, we usually do. Sarah and I exchanged a quick glance as I hit the lights and sirens. Riverside Drive was an old, narrow road on the outskirts of town, bordered by woods that seemed to swallow up any light that tried to break through. We sped down the road, the ambulance lights bouncing off the thick fog, making it hard to see where the pavement ended and the forest began. When we arrived at the address, something immediately felt off. The house was dark, no porch light, no signs of life. Just a faint glow from an upstairs window, barely visible through the thick fog. We grabbed our gear and rushed to the front door, which was slightly open. EMT. I shouted as we pushed the door open. There was no answer, only an oppressive silence that seemed to fill every corner of the house. The place was old, with creaky wooden floors and peeling wallpaper. Cold air moved through the hallway, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We found the patient in the living room, slumped over on an old, tattered couch. He was an older man, probably in his 70s, with a bony face and sunken eyes. His skin was pale, almost gray, and he wasn't breathing. There was no pulse. "Let's move him to the floor," Sarah said, already reaching for the AED. We went through the motions, compressions, breaths, but something wasn't right. The man's skin was ice cold, and despite our efforts, his body felt stiff, more so than it should have for someone who had just gone into cardiac arrest. "I think he's been dead for a while," Sarah said, her voice wavering. But the call came in just a few minutes ago. I looked around the room, trying to make sense of the situation. That's when I noticed something strange. The old man's eyes, which had been closed when we arrived, were now open, staring blankly at the ceiling. My heart skipped a beat. It was impossible. I had checked his eyes when we first assessed him. They were closed. I was sure of it. "Sarah," I started to say, but she was focused on the monitor, her face pale. "There's something wrong here." Then the monitor beeped. A single, faint blip. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The man had no pulse, no signs of life, but the monitor showed a single heartbeat. It was weak, almost subtle, but it was there. "This doesn't make any sense," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. He's dead, but..." Before I could respond, the man's body jerked violently, his back arching off the floor. It was as if some invisible force was pulling him upward. The motion was so sudden, so unnatural, that Sarah and I both jumped back. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The man collapsed back onto the floor, motionless once again. The monitor flatlined, the room fell into a strange silence, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. Sarah nodded, and we quickly packed up our gear, moving toward the door. But as we turned to leave, we heard it, the sound that still haunts me to this day. It was a heartbeat, loud and clear, coming from the darkness of the hallway. At first, I thought it was the monitor glitching, but it wasn't. The sound was real, almost tangible, echoing off the walls of the old house. We froze, both of us staring into the pitch-black hallway. The sound grew louder, faster, like whatever was making it was getting closer. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the heartbeat stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. But the fear in Sarah's eyes told me she had heard it too. Without another word, we bolted out of the house, practically throwing ourselves into the ambulance. I didn't look back as we sped away, but I could feel something watching us, something that didn't want us to leave. We reported the incident to our supervisor, but when the police arrived at the house, they found nothing unusual, no sign of the old man, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was as if the whole event had never happened. The house was empty, abandoned, and had been for years, according to the neighbors. Sarah and I were questioned repeatedly, but our story never changed. We saw what we saw, heard what we heard, but no one believed us. The official report said the call was a false alarm, that there was no evidence of a cardiac arrest or any other emergency at that address. But I know the truth. We both do. That night, we encountered something that defied explanation, something that blurred the line between life and death. And every time I close my eyes, I hear it, the sound of a heartbeat in the dark, reminding me that some things are beyond our understanding, beyond our control. It's been years since that call, but I still can't shake the feeling that whatever we encountered in that house isn't finished with us. I don't usually talk about what I see on the job, but I can't keep this one to myself. It started as a routine call. A pizza delivery guy, mid-20s, found unresponsive outside an apartment building. The 911 dispatcher had flagged it as a possible overdose, nothing unusual in this part of town. I was on shift with my partner, Jason, and we were the first to arrive at the scene. The building was one of those old, run-down complexes, the kind you pass by without a second glance. It was past midnight, and the street was eerily quiet except for the faint hum of distant traffic. As we pulled up, the flashing lights of our ambulance cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. I spotted the pizza delivery car parked haphazardly by the curb, the engine still running, headlights cutting through the darkness. The guy was sprawled out on the sidewalk, his face illuminated by the sickly yellow streetlight. At first glance, he looked dead, eyes wide open, mouth slightly ajar, with an expression of sheer terror frozen on his face. I knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. Nothing. His skin was cold to the touch, but there was no sign of rigor mortis yet, so he hadn't been dead for long. Jason started preparing the defibrillator, but something about the scene didn't sit right with me. This wasn't like any overdose I'd ever seen. I leaned closer, examining the body. There were no track marks, no obvious signs of drug use. His uniform was neat, no signs of struggle, no blood. Just that haunting look of fear etched into his face. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen something that had scared him to death. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. Is he dead? I looked up to see a woman standing in the doorway of the apartment building, clutching a bathrobe tightly around her. She looked pale, shaken. Yes, I replied, standing up. Do you know what happened? She hesitated, her eyes darting to the lifeless body on the ground. I ordered the pizza. He called to say he was outside, but when I came down to get it, I found him like this. Jason, who had been silent up to this point, glanced at me with a frown. Did you see anyone else? Maybe someone who could have attacked him. She shook her head vigorously. No, no one. He was alone. I exchanged a look with Jason. This wasn't adding up. There had to be more to the story. Do you mind if we come in? I asked. We need to ask you a few more questions. She hesitated again, but then nodded, stepping aside to let us in. The lobby was dimly lit, with a stale smell lingering in the air. She led us up a flight of stairs to her apartment on the second floor. The place was small and sparsely furnished, a few cardboard boxes stacked in the corner suggesting she hadn't been there long. As she sat down on the couch, I noticed her hands were trembling. Jason took the lead, asking her the usual questions: name, how long she'd lived here, if she'd noticed anything strange before the incident. But her answers were vague, almost evasive. "What did he say to you on the phone?" I asked, interrupting Jason's line of questioning. She blinked, as if the question had caught her off guard. "He just said he was outside with the pizza. That's all." "Are you sure?" I pressed. "Did he sound normal?" Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. He sounded nervous, like he was in a hurry." Jason sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, ma'am, we're just trying to figure out what happened. Anything you can tell us." A sudden thud from the hallway made us all jump. Jason and I exchanged a glance before he cautiously moved to the door and peered out. "There's no one out here," he said, but his voice was tense. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but growing stronger, a metallic, coppery scent that made my stomach churn. I followed it, stepping closer to the boxes in the corner. The woman noticed what I was doing and suddenly bolted upright. "Wait, don't." But it was too late. I had already lifted the lid of the top box, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. Wrapped in plastic, with only the face exposed, was another body, a man, his expression frozen in the same terror as the delivery guy outside. He was dressed in the same uniform, a name tag identifying him as another delivery driver from the same pizza place. I staggered back, my mind racing. How long had this been here? Who was this woman? Jason turned to the woman, his hand instinctively going to his radio. "What the hell is going on here?" She didn't answer, her eyes wild with panic. Instead, she bolted for the door, but Jason was quicker. He tackled her to the ground, pinning her down as she screamed and thrashed, her voice echoing through the apartment. I was too shocked to move at first, but I quickly snapped out of it and grabbed my own radio, calling for backup. As we waited, I looked around the apartment, noticing for the first time how meticulously clean it was. Too clean. No personal belongings, no photos, nothing to suggest who this woman really was. Just those boxes, stacked neatly in the corner, each one potentially containing another gruesome secret. The woman stopped struggling, her chest heaving as she glared up at us with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They came to me. They wouldn't stop. I had to get rid of them." "Get rid of who?" I demanded. "What are you talking about?" But she just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You'll see. They'll come for you too." The police arrived shortly after, and we handed her over, still rambling incoherently about them and how she had no choice. As they led her away, Jason and I stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. We later learned that she had been ordering pizzas from different places for weeks, each time targeting a different delivery driver. The bodies were found all over the apartment, stuffed into closets, hidden under floorboards. There was no clear motive, no pattern to her madness, just a horrifying collection of victims who had all answered the same innocent call. It's been a few months now, and I still can't shake the memory of those lifeless faces, frozen in terror. Every time I pass a delivery driver on the street, I wonder if they'll be next, if somewhere out there, another call is about to be made, and another life is about to be taken. And that woman's final words still haunt me. "You'll see. They'll come for you too." I've worked the night shift as a cop in one of the most notorious neighborhoods in the city for over a decade, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for that night. The night I came face to face with true evil. It started with a call that came in just after 2 a.m. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost too calm, as she relayed the message: possible drug activity, 37th Maple Street. Units in the vicinity, please respond. It was a familiar street. It was familiar to every cop on the force. The kind of place where the lines between night and day blurred, where the streets were ruled by the dealers, the addicts, and the desperate souls caught in between. But this call was different. There was something in the dispatcher's voice that sent a shiver down my spine, a crack in her usually calm professional voice. I hit the lights and sped towards the address. The streets were empty, as they often were at that hour, but the tension in the air was tense. My partner, Mike, sat beside me, his jaw clenched tight. He was a good cop, sharp, quick-witted, but tonight he was quiet. Too quiet. "Something's off about this one," he said, almost to himself. "Yeah," I agreed, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Feels like we're walking into a trap." When we pulled up to the scene, the first thing I noticed was the car. It was a sleek, black Mercedes parked haphazardly under a broken streetlight, the engine still running. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but the license plate, a custom plate that read Dark King, sent a chill through me. This wasn't the usual junkie or small-time dealer. This was something much bigger. We approached cautiously, guns drawn, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The smell hit me first, metallic, coppery, like blood. It was coming from the trunk. I glanced at Mike, and he nodded. We both knew what we had to do. The trunk of the black Mercedes clicked open immediately. Inside was a man, tied up, beaten beyond recognition, barely clinging to his life. His face was swollen, his clothes soaked in blood, but what really caught my attention was the symbol carved into his chest. A brutal, rough crown, like something out of a nightmare. "Jesus Christ," Mike breathed, taking a step back. I reached for the radio, ready to call it in, but the man suddenly staggered forward, gasping for air. His eyes snapped open, wide with terror, and he set out a single word: "Run." Before we could react, the screech of tires tore through the night. Another car, an SUV with heavily tinted windows, rode down the street towards us. There was no time to think, no time to act, just pure, animalistic instinct. We ran out of the way as the SUV slammed into the Mercedes, sending it, and the man in the trunk, crashing into the wall. Gunfire erupted from the SUV. I hit the ground, rolling behind a parked car as bullets sprayed around us. I could hear Mike cursing, returning fire, but the bastards were too quick. The SUV ran off, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had come, leaving nothing but shattered glass and the stench of burnt rubber. When the dust settled, I crawled back to the wreckage. The man in the trunk was dead, his body disfigured beyond recognition. But what shook me to my core was the message written on the wall in blood, smeared across the brick in a haste: "The King watches." We called it in, but even as backup arrived, I knew we were in over our heads. This wasn't just a drug deal gone wrong. This was something else entirely. Something darker. Something that went far beyond the streets of our city. Over the next few weeks, the bodies started turning up. Each one more shocking than the last, each one bearing the same brutal rough crown carved into their flesh. Dealers, runners, even some of the low-level enforcers we'd tangled with before, they were all being hunted, all being butchered like animals. And with each new body, the message became clearer: someone was cleaning house. Someone who wanted us to know that they were in control. Mike and I were pulled into the investigation, but every lead we chased ended in blood. The witnesses we managed to find were too terrified to talk, and those who weren't ended up dead before they could say a word. It was like trying to catch a ghost, a shadow that moved through the city with freedom. The tipping point came on a cold, rainy night. We were staking out an old warehouse down by the docks, a place we'd heard whispers about, a rumored stash house for a major shipment of cocaine. It was supposed to be a routine bust, in and out. But as we watched from the car, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Tall, dressed in black from head to toe, with a face that was nothing but darkness. Even from a distance, I could feel the malice radiating off of him. He moved with a calmness that was almost unnatural, walking straight into the warehouse like he owned the place. Moments later, the screams started. Blood-curdling, inhuman screams that echoed through the night. We rushed in, guns drawn, but by the time we got there, it was too late. The inside of the warehouse was a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay across the floor, the walls painted with blood. And in the center of it all, surrounded by a sea of red, was a throne. A makeshift throne made of cocaine bricks, and sitting on it was the man in black. The Dark King. His eyes met mine, and in that instant, I knew I was looking at something beyond human, something that thrived on the fear and chaos it created. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a jolt of terror through me. And then he was gone, vanished into the night like a wisp of smoke. We were left standing in that warehouse, surrounded by death, knowing that we had just witnessed the birth of a legend. The Dark King wasn't just a man. He was a force, a terror that would haunt the streets long after we were gone. I've seen a lot in my years on the force, but that night, I realized there are some evils that can't be fought, can't be stopped. Some evils that don't just live in the darkness, they are the darkness. And as much as we like to think we're in control, the truth is, we're just pawns in a game played by monsters. And the Dark King, he's still out there, watching, waiting for the next night to fall. It was well past midnight when the call came through, pulling me out of the quiet peace of the night shift. My partner, Officer Jacobs, was in the passenger seat, drinking a cup of lukewarm coffee as we cruised through the nearly deserted streets of our small city. We'd just finished responding to a routine noise complaint. Some teenagers partying too loudly in their parents' basement when the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, tense and clipped. Unit 9, we've got a possible 10 to 32 at 264 East Woodside Avenue. Shots fired, multiple casualties reported. Proceed with caution. A 10 to 32, gunfight in progress. The adrenaline hit me like a shot of cold water to the face. This wasn't supposed to happen in our town. Sure, we had our share of petty crimes, but nothing like this. Nothing like what was waiting for us at that address. I floored the gas, the engine roaring as we tore through the streets, lights flashing, siren wailing. East Woodside Avenue was on the rougher side of town, where the houses were crumbling and the streetlights flashed like dying stars. The kind of place you didn't want to be caught after dark. As we pulled up to the address, the first thing I noticed was the strange silence. The street was deserted, not a soul in sight, and yet the tension in the air was tense. The house at 264 Avenue was an old, two-story Victorian, its windows dark and spooky. There were no lights on inside, but the front door was wide open, hanging off its hinges. Jacobs and I exchanged a glance. He looked as uneasy as I felt, but there was no time for hesitation. We drew our weapons and approached the house, our footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. The smell hit us before we even crossed the threshold, a sickly sweet stench that clung to the back of your throat. Police. If anyone's in there, come out with your hands up. I shouted, my voice sounding far more confident than I felt. No response. Just the oppressive silence, broken only by the distant hum of the city. We entered the house cautiously, guns raised, moving the first floor room by room. The living room was a mess, furniture overturned, bullet holes in the walls, and blood splattered across the floor. But there were no bodies, just the evidence of a violent struggle. The kitchen was worse. The smell of death was stronger here, and when we saw the source, my stomach churned. 2 men lay stretched out on the floor, their bodies filled with bullet holes. One had been shot in the head at close range, the other in the chest. Both were dead, their eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Jesus Christ, Jacob said, his voice shaky. He has been on the force for nearly as long as I had, but nothing prepares you for this. I forced myself to stay focused, pushing the nausea down. There was no time for that now. We moved upstairs, each step on the creaking wooden stairs sending a jolt of anxiety through me. The second floor was just as quiet, just as unnerving. At the end of the hallway, there was a door slightly open, a faint light coming out from within. I motioned for Jacobs to cover me as I pushed the door open. The room was a bedroom, but it looked more like a war zone. The bed was drenched in blood, and there was another body lying on the floor, half hidden behind the bed frame. But it wasn't the body that caught my attention, it was the man standing over it. He was tall, muscular, with a face hardened by years of violence. His clothes were stained with blood, and in his hand, he held a gun, still smoking. He didn't look surprised to see us. If anything, he seemed almost bored, like he'd been expecting us. "Drop the weapon," I ordered, my gun pointing at him. The man smiled a cold, empty smile that sent a shiver down my spine. He raised the gun slightly, and for a split second, I thought he was going to shoot. But instead, he tossed it to the floor, the metal clattering against the hardwood. "All right, you got me," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. "But you're too late. The show's already over." I didn't lower my gun. There was something in his eyes, something that told me this wasn't just a simple arrest. "Get down on the ground, hands behind your head." He complied, slowly lowering himself to his knees, his eyes never leaving mine. Jacobs moved in to cuff him, but as he did, the man chuckled softly. "You really don't know what you've walked into, do you?" he murmured. Before I could respond, there was a sudden, sharp noise, like a distant explosion, followed by a low rumble that made the floor tremble beneath our feet. I shot a glance at Jacobs, who looked as confused as I felt. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The man on the floor just smiled wider. "You'll find out soon enough." My instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but it was too late. The rumbling grew louder, and then the entire house shook violently. I stumbled, barely managing to keep my balance as the walls around us began to crack and splinter. "Move!" I shouted, grabbing Jacobs by the arm and dragging him toward the stairs. But as we reached the top of the staircase, the floor beneath us gave way with a deafening crash. We fell, wood and plaster collapsing around us, and I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Surprised, I tried to push myself up, but my leg was trapped under a heavy plank, pain shooting through my body with every movement. "Jacobs!" I called out, my voice sounding rough. I couldn't see him through the dust and debris, but I could hear him groaning in pain somewhere nearby. Then, through the haze, I saw him, the man we'd been about to arrest. He stood over me, somehow untouched by the collapse, his eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction. He bent down beside me, close enough that I could see the madness lurking just beneath the surface. "Should have stayed in your car, officer," he said softly, almost sympathetically. Then he stood up and walked away, leaving me there, pinned and helpless, as the house continued to crumble around us. I don't remember much after that, just flashes of noise and pain, the sound of sirens in the distance, and the overwhelming fear that I wasn't going to make it out alive. By the time backup arrived and pulled us from the wreckage, the man was long gone, vanished into the night like a ghost. The official report labeled it as a botched drug raid, a violent struggle between rival dealers that ended in disaster. The house had been rigged to explode, they said, part of some twisted plan to wipe out the competition. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. That man, whoever he was, had known we were coming. He'd been waiting for us, and he walked away without a scratch. I never saw him again, but his face haunts me to this day. The way he smiled, like he knew something we didn't, like he was always one step ahead. I've faced danger before, but nothing has ever shaken me like that night. The realization that sometimes the people you're up against aren't just criminals, they're predators, playing a game you don't even know you're in until it's too late. And when you're up against someone like that, the rules don't matter. All you can do is survive, if you're lucky. There's a moment in every cop's life when you realize the line between justice and survival is thinner than you ever imagined. For me, that moment came on a rainy Wednesday night, deep in the heart of the city. It was supposed to be an easy shift. Just another night of patrolling the streets, breaking up bar fights, and keeping the peace in a neighborhood that had seen better days. My partner, Officer Davies, and I were cruising through the industrial district, a maze of decaying warehouses and abandoned lots, when the call came in. Unit 12, we've got a possible 10 to 75 at the old Johnson Cannery. Backup requested. Suspects believed to be heavily armed. A 10 to 75 is a major drug bust in progress. The Johnson Cannery had been shut down for years, the memory of the city's dying manufacturing industry. Lately, it had become a hotspot for all sorts of illegal activity, but this was the first time we'd been called in for something on this scale. My gut told me this was big, maybe too big for just the two of us, but protocol was protocol. I hit the lights and sirens, and we sped through the empty streets, the rain pounding against the windshield. As we approached the cannery, I stopped the siren and slowed down, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The place was dark, the only light coming from a few flickering street lamps. The massive building loomed ahead of us, its broken windows like black, empty eyes staring down at us. Davies shifted uneasily in his seat. "You think this is the cartel?" I nodded grimly. "Has to be. Nobody else around here has the muscle to pull off something like this." The cartels had been creeping into the city for months, bringing with them a wave of violence and fear that we've never seen before. They were ruthless, well-organized, and didn't give a damn about who got caught in the crossfire. And now, it looked like they'd set up shop right under our noses. We parked a block away and approached the cannery on foot, our guns drawn, every nerve on high alert. The rain had turned the ground into a muddy mess, making every step a struggle. As we got closer, I could hear the faint hum of voices coming from inside the building, mixed with the low rumble of a generator. We reached the back entrance, a rusted metal door that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I tested the handle, and to my surprise, it swung open with a creak. Davies shot me a wary look, and I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. This was too easy. We slipped inside, the musty smell of the old building hitting us immediately. The place was a labyrinth of corridors and stairwells, all leading to the main factory floor. We moved silently, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dirt that covered everything. As we neared the factory floor, the voices became louder and clearer. I could make out little bits of conversation, orders being given, deals being made. And then, suddenly, a voice that made my blood run cold. "It's all here, just like we agreed. But if you try to screw us over, you're dead." It was Alvarez. Marco Alvarez, the most feared drug lord in the city, maybe even the entire state. He was known for his brutality, leaving a trail of bodies wherever he went. We'd been trying to nail him for years, but he was always one step ahead, always disappearing before we could get close. And now, here he was, just a few feet away. Davies and I exchanged a look. This was our chance, the break we'd been waiting for. But something about this didn't feel right. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and backup was still at least 10 minutes out. If we went in now, it would be a suicide mission. But we didn't have a choice. Alvarez was here, and if we let him slip away again, who knew when we'd get another shot at him? We crept forward, staying low, until we reached the edge of the factory floor. The scene that greeted us was like something out of a nightmare. There were at least a dozen men, all armed to the teeth, surrounding a long table piled high with bricks of cocaine. Alvarez stood at the head of the table, flanked by his lieutenants, calmly overseeing the transaction. My heart was pounding in my chest as I surveyed the room. There was no way we could take them all, but we had to try. I glanced at Davies, and he gave me a sharp nod. We were going in. Just as we were about to move, something caught my eye. a figure lurking in the shadows on the other side of the room. I squinted my eyes, trying to make out who it was, but before I could, a gunshot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. Chaos erupted. The men at the table scattered, drawing their weapons, and all hell broke loose. Davies and I dove for cover as bullets tore through the air around us. I fired blindly into the chaos, my mind racing, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. And then I saw him, the figure in the shadows, moving with a deadly precision, picking off Alvarez's men one by one. It wasn't one of ours. He was too fast, too ruthless. Whoever he was working alone. Alvarez, realizing the trap, made a break for it, running toward the exit. I broke cover, charging after him, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear Davies shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. This was it, our one chance to take Alvarez down. I rounded the corner just in time to see Alvarez burst through the back door, disappearing into the night. I followed, but the rain was coming down in sheets, and I could barely see 2 feet in front of me. I pushed on, driven by adrenaline and desperation, until I saw him, a dark figure in the distance, running for his life. I raised my gun, took aim, and fired. The shot echoed through the night, and Alvarez stumbled, falling to the ground. I ran up to him, my breath coming in unsteady gasps. He was on his knees, clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. "You don't know what you've done," he said, his voice filled with pain and something else, fear. Before I could respond, there was a flash of movement behind him, and the figure from the shadows stepped into view. He was tall, muscular, with a face that was both familiar and terrifying. He looked down at Alvarez with a cool, calculating expression, then raised his gun. "No loose ends," the man said quietly, and pulled the trigger. Alvarez's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless. I stood there, frozen, staring at the man who had just executed the most wanted drug lord in the city. He turned to me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "This never happened," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You never saw me. If you want to stay alive, you'll forget this night ever existed." Before I could react, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving me standing there in the pouring rain, my gun still in my hand. When backup finally arrived, they found me standing over Alvarez's body, drenched and silent. The official report would say that we'd taken down Alvarez in a firefight, that Davies and I had been the heroes of the night. But I knew the truth. We were pawns in a game we didn't even understand, and the real players had just moved on to their next target. Davies and I never spoke about what happened that night. We couldn't. Because deep down, we both knew that the line we'd crossed was one we could never come back from.